This episode, I'm joined by Raphael Cormack to discuss his book, Holy Men of the Electromagnetic Age, A Forgotten History of the Occult. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Raphael Cormack, thanks very much for joining me on Hermetics podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me. I'm excited to talk about the book.
As you said, we're going to be discussing your recently published in March this year, book, Holy Men of the Electromagnetic Age, A Forgotten History of the Occult, which was published by Hearst Publishers. And a big thank you to them for sending me a review copy. And as we were discussing before we started recording, the subtitle here, A Forgotten History of the Occult, is often thrown onto various books or an underground history or for an overlooked history, and more often than not you'll open these books and find a lot of familiar figures. Now, I will say, as someone who's read countless books on this subject, this is one of the few times, the main time in memory, where I can think a sort of immediate suspicion of a forgotten history. And truly, I've never come across the two figures who have these fascinating great lives that you are focusing on in the book. So the book is, the background is the interwar period. So we're filled to the brim with clairvoyants, spiritualists, the sort of the burgeoning energy of the new age, and people, sort of blasting out into anything and everything. But the two figures grounding this are Tahar Bay and then Dr. Dahesh, and then there's also a sort of an imitator in there as well that we'll get to. As I said, never came across these two figures, but we'll get to this. It's a strange book, strange history. Raphael, tell us a little bit about yourself. What it is you do in the origins of this book.
Yeah, and I think maybe in the origins will come some of the answers to this question of why you had perhaps never heard of these two people. So I'm a kind of specialist in the cultural history of the 20th century Arab world, basically, and Egypt a little bit more specifically. So I've worked on theatre. The book I wrote before this was about the cabarets of 1920s Cairo, basically, told through its female performers. And that's sort of where I found the kernel that led to the creation of this book, which was that at a lot of these cabaret performances in Cairo in the 1920s, you'd have singers, you'd have dancers, you'd have all the kind of things you might expect, but you also had spiritualists and hypnotists appear on stage, one of whom, Dr. Dahesh. I then sort of tracked him through various different places and ended up writing a book about him, at least in part. But what I kind of originally meant to do was, okay, I saw that there are all these spiritualists, all these hypnotists in the cabaret, in the popular culture scene of the Arab world. And basically, I wanted to answer the question of what is going on with the occult in the Arab world in the 20s and 30s. That was the original kind of thought. It seemed to be everywhere. And like you say, you literally never hear anything about it ever, I would say.
No.
Particularly in sort of Western histories of the modern occult, you will often hear that, people go to the Middle East and are inspired by kind of Eastern things. But I remember reading a book, but I can't remember which book it is now, so I'm not going to name and shame it. But it basically said there is no history of the occult in the modern Middle East in the way that we understand it. But clearly that was not true. Mm-hmm. Clearly it's everywhere. So I tried, and I went through a lot of iterations with this book. There's lots of different people who now appear as perhaps in a paragraph or two, but who had whole chapters, one of whom is this woman, Valentine de Saint-Point, who went to Cairo in the 1920s as a theosophist and kind of started this basically theosophical movement there, anti-colonial. She actually has a totally fascinating life. But I just couldn't get her to fit. Mm-hmm. So what I ended up doing is picking these two men who I guess we'll probably talk about a little bit more, as ways of saying, well, what was going on with the occult in the Arab world? And then it became clear too that if you're going to talk about the Middle Eastern modern occult, you have to deal with Europe. You have to look at Europe too. You have to look at America, because it's this movement, perhaps like very few others, that really travels constantly. There's so much like international kind of linking. Lots of people are going to different places, and lots of people are taking things from different places. It's really, I mean, everything in this period has movement, but this has it more than lots of places. So I decided that these two guys were basically the most interesting, because both of them had fascinating life stories too. Most interesting way to look at this question of, well, okay, not just what's going on with the occult in the early 20th century. That's a big question in general. Why are so many people into it? But what links does it have with the thing that kind of interests me and that is my field, which is the Middle East, which so few people have talked about.
Mm-hmm. And I'm interested just in the usage of the term occult, because one thing that is really, it's almost comical at times in the way, not that your book's comical, but as the history of it is comical, because there's a two strange sides to it. Because on the one side, you do have, I guess what you'd say, occultism in not literal, but hidden spiritual forces, clairvoyance, speaking to the dead, actual mysticism that Blavatsky of the Theosophists is talking about. And on the other side, these two are always sort of touching toes, is like stage shows and hypnotism and this kind of magic. So you have, Crowley's magic with a K on one side, and then you have stage shows, which is a huge part of your book, on the other side. And the occult of this book falls in the middle. And so at times you're sort of like, well, hang on, what are the audience expecting at times? So how exactly are you using the term occult here?
Yeah. And this question of, well, and what are the audience thinking, is one that maybe we'll come to in a bit. But it's really hard, because the occult is, as far as I'm concerned, basically an undefinable term in some ways. I mean, you can come up with various definitions for it, but they always have problems. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you have to define it, because otherwise, what else are you talking about? Mm-hmm. And clearly, there is something which people thought of as the occult. It might be, it's very hard to come up with a kind of definition of the occult that doesn't just include every mainstream religion as well. It's something about the powers of the unseen world to influence our world. That's clearly in there, but that's probably true of a lot of religions too, except for very kind of rational ones. So, and maybe you just think, well, actually, there isn't much difference between religions and the occult, and that's the definition I'm going to go with, and fine, fight me on it. Which is an option. It's sort of not one that I decided to go with, because these guys seem to be doing something a little bit different. So in the end, I basically, which maybe you see as something of a cop out, but I thought was the only way to really do it, is to see this as kind of a historical movement, and a historical moment, and a historical phenomenon, as it were. So sort of to say, well, what I'm going to include in my definition of the occult basically is everything that you need to know to explain what these guys were doing. Mm-hmm. That's fair. Historically speaking. And like lots of other people, I think I decided that started in 1848 with the Fox sisters hearing banging in their cabin in upstate New York. I assume quite a lot of people listening to this will know this story already.
I'm not sure they will, actually. So first time it's come up. So this is banging in upstate New York in 1840.
Yeah. There's, two sisters start to hear it. It continues. They eventually come to the conclusion that it's the ghost, basically, or the spirit of a peddler who died underneath their house and is now communicating with them from beyond the grave. And this is the kind of thing that has happened before 1848, people hearing bangings which they think belong to a ghost. But the difference here is that they, number one, started to be able to communicate with other spirits from beyond the kind of beyond the veil other than just this one ghost. They kind of opened up a portal. And number two, for some reason which no one has really been able to explain, though lots of people have tried, this became a huge international movement within the space of about 2 years, really. I mean, it was something was in the air, or the grass was very dry, as it were, and this one flame lit up this kind of huge craze, if you want to call it that, movement, belief system.
Do you have any of your own theses as why this is?
It's in a sense it's a little bit unexplainable, because you can explain it in the case of, let's say, America, if you wanted to be historical about it. I mean, one explanation is, of course, this is an explanation that spiritualists would favor, is, well, it's true. And so therefore it happened, and people had discovered that it was true. It's like any scientific discovery, right? And that's how lots of people put it. And at some point it's discovered, and then people experiment with it. If you wanted to be more kind of, I guess, sociological or something about it, you can say, oh, well, in that period in North America and perhaps Europe, religious faith is slightly kind of being challenged. People are looking for metaphysical explanations to things, but ones that don't necessarily go through the established church, say, and that checks out with a lot of people who become spiritualists. So they're often pretty radical politically. I mean, they're often kind of non-conformist religious figures. So people, i.e., who are religious but don't quite necessarily see the established church as expressing that in the best way. Interestingly, and it's not really something I thought, a lot of early feminists and abolitionists also joined this movement. So clearly it's giving people something who are dissatisfied with the status quo, something that they need. But I can't explain why it spreads globally so quickly, which it does seem to. I mean, in Syria, within the space of about a year or two, you get accounts of people, trying to summon spirits.
And this is in 1849.
In the late 1840s, yeah, early 1850s. So how it spreads so quickly there, I mean, a little bit hard to say.
And this, would you say that this for you is really the spark of this still ongoing New Age movement? This sort of plethora of largely individualistic, small community of, we found a guru, we found a thing, and we've coalesced around it for a little while. This kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, any kind of historical writing, you can always say, well, you say one particular thing starts here. Well, actually, I think here's 20 years earlier a similar thing. But yeah, it seems to be the spark for what then later develops in various ways into all kind of different forms of occult practice. And I mean, so just, Theosophy, which was started by Madame Blavatsky, she started off as a spiritualist, even though she sort of later sort of tries to deny that, but she did. And then all of these kind of Order of the Golden Dawn people of late 19th century, they all, it's hard to imagine them existing without spiritualism having existed first, even though they're not just doing spiritualism.
Yeah, I know. We a previous episode actually, just to moving from this period through to the interwar period, where as you mentioned, the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn, it's in this interwar period. We were on a previous episode when we were with the guest discussing the work of Rudolf Steiner and Stirner and the overlap of esotericism and politics. One thing you notice, and it's so difficult, and I sort of don't envy you in writing about it. This period, this specific interwar period, just anyone and everyone, it doesn't matter what sort of camp you're in, whether it's political, spiritual, you name it, everyone is just, it's like dynamite everywhere. And we see this here also, is that it just seems to be this time of not necessarily sort of chaotic in a negative sense, but chaotic, we will just take something and run with it. And did you find that this was the case in these terms of occultism as well?
Yeah, so it seems to be true that there are sort of various big waves of what happens, but then the 20s and 30s is the period that I then became most interested in. So that's a sort of, whether you call that the second wave or the third wave, I'm not sure exactly which wave you put it, but definitely, like you say, a massive wave of interest in this kind of thing where, like you say, you sort of can't swing a cat without hitting someone who is in some way interested in the occult. Whether, what that means is sometimes very hard to tie down. And that's part of the reason why I had to tie this book down to these two guys, because the moment you start going, well, who is this person then influenced by? You find someone else who has sort of similar, but then in some ways totally different views too, and you're stuck in a game of trying to tie down what everyone believes when everyone has their own extremely idiosyncratic sort of system, which changes quite frequently throughout their life too.
And so, amidst this, to introduce our first figure, Tahar Bay arrives on the scene, and I mean, yeah, I will allow you to introduce, because it's just such a strange feeling of these guys really arriving on the scene.
He comes, and he is the guy who kind of, without him, none of the other characters in this book would exist in quite the same way. Even if that's just literally chronologically speaking, he is the first, and they all are influenced by him. But maybe there's something more to it than that too. And he appears, he is born an Armenian called Krikor Kalfayan in 1900 in Istanbul. It's always, I'm unsure when to sort of reveal his true backstory, because between about 1900 and 1923, there are lots of different stories about what he's doing exactly. This is the period of the Armenian genocide, which doesn't really come to Istanbul in the sense that he's safe in Istanbul, but likely quite a lot of his family, extended family, were probably killed. And this hangs over a lot of the stories of that time in his life. Although he never specifically mentions it, but there are very, he leaves Istanbul probably around 1920, is turned into a refugee almost certainly again, though he never mentions that. He comes up with all these various stories about studying with sheikhs in Egypt or going to Smyrna and sort of hoodwinking priests. But he turns up in Athens in 1923, and this is sort of the first time we can definitively put him on the historical record. And he is not Krikor Kalfayan in Athens in 1923, the Armenian from Istanbul. He is Tahar Bay, the kind of Egyptian fakir, which is what he calls himself. And what makes him an occult figure is that he can use the power of his mind and spirit to control his physical body. So he can use unseen powers, as it were. This is why he somehow fits into a definition of the occult, to shut down his heart rate. He can alter his heart rate. He can stick a needle in his arm without feeling any pain and make blood flow or not flow. And then his big sort of finale act is that he can bury himself alive in a coffin under the ground and survive in a state of kind of death. So he can induce this death-like state in himself. And in Athens in 1923, a period of which the city is really going through a lot, and there are a lot of refugees coming in, both Armenian but mostly Greek from the former Ottoman Empire. It's a period of flux, and this is the sort of leitmotif that goes throughout the book. In these periods of flux, these are the times when these kind of slightly unusual characters who claim to be able to do things which are not quite physically possible often appear. He appears in Athens and causes something of a sensation. People can't quite understand what he's doing. He gets all these fans. He starts to put on sort of shows pretty quickly. And he, more than the other figure in this book, Dr. Dahesh, is kind of from the beginning something of a stage performer, although an occult stage performer, i.e., a person who doesn't just say, wow, look at this magic trick I'm doing, but who says, I have secrets which you do not understand, and I'm going to put them into. I'm just going to demonstrate them on the stage, but there's something bigger going on. He goes to Athens. Lots of people like him. Lots of people also hate him. Long story short, he's kind of chased out of Athens, goes to Rome very briefly, but in 1925 ends up in Paris. And this is where he really becomes, at least for this, we can debate, because as you said, now I would say absolutely no one has ever heard of this guy. Like, he is not known, except for perhaps a few real kind of fanatics. But in 1925 to 1926, everyone had heard of him. Not just in Paris, but in Paris. He's in the newspapers in lots of places, but in Paris, he is there. He's doing pretty much the same act, with the same explanations, although they've slightly developed at this point.
So just to hold there, because I mean, to mention one figure who also is, in a certain sense, becomes directly connected to this, which is Houdini. I mean, Houdini is also doing this kind of stuff. So it seems that the fascination isn't, we're interested in this kind of what wouldn't be fakirism if Houdini was doing it. Just here's what I can do with my body, here's how I can do strange feats. But with fakirism, it seems that the greater interest is because he's saying there's something else going on. So what is this other apparent thing that is going on for him?
Yeah, and it's always a little bit vague. So he publishes, around the time he comes to Paris, he publishes a whole book called My Secrets, in which he talks about what he's doing. Although, to be honest, it's somewhat vague. But the central idea is that he is harnessing a kind of secret power, a hidden power, to control his body. And he then begins, in this book, he expands that out and says, well, this can be applied to various different things, and begins, although he never really completes, but to turn this into a kind of philosophy of living your life. Others, like Hamid Bey, sort of later take this even further, but just say like, oh, well, if you embrace this kind of science of fakirism, you too can not only, I don't know, pierce your arm with a needle, but you could also live a great life too. And if everyone embraces this, all suffering is going to end in some way. And he has these big kind of messianic claims. At the same time, the other thing that does kind of really cement some of his popularity is behind this, he also gets onto stage various different medical professionals, the doctors, to try and explain his act. And none of them appear to be able to.
Right.
So he is doing something that is in some way genuinely kind of mysterious, at least for a little bit.
Yeah. And then down the line, people really... There's one person in particular, I believe, who really does try and make it seems a singular job to disprove. Because I remember with the needle through the arm, they had the theory of one side has like was it cocaine?
Yeah, that was in Greece. There was some guy said he injected cocaine into one side, and
so that side was bleed
into the other side, which seems, to be honest, oftentimes the explanation seems more far-fetched than it's saying it's just supernatural, which I think in that case it sort of does. But yeah, eventually lots of people come along and say, well, actually, and this main central part of his act, which is the burial alive, people replicate and say, well, actually, you can go into a coffin, an airtight, sealed coffin, for about an hour, which is usually about how long he does it for, and you can survive. And maybe we'll get to, and that is in fact literally what Houdini does. So then so Tahar Bay, he has this year of huge fame, and then it kind of dwindles, but like any good occult performer, he never gives up.
Mm-hmm.
He really keeps going. He goes through the 20s, through the 30s. He shifts his acts a little bit, but not very much, to be honest. And he's pretty. There's a very disgraceful event that happens during the Second World War, and then in the 50s, he tries to reinvent himself, and in LA, and actually ends up staying with Aldous Huxley for a little bit. And Aldous Huxley tries to get him to cure his wife's cancer, which never really comes off.
Right.
And anyway, it's a really fascinating rest of his life. But for the purposes of the broader narrative, what is important is that big year in Paris, because that is when he becomes famous, and that is when he starts to get imitators who then branch off in various different directions. And sort of much of the book is involved then charting, well, what happened to the people who then started copying him.
Yeah, and before we get to those sort of branching off, I am intrigued as just to your own thoughts on, because I mean, I guess we still have a culture of what we could lightly call fakirism today with David Blaine, right? Still,
yeah,
he literally still does shove metal through my arm or his arm, which to me, watching it, I'm interested. I mean, maybe this is just me, right? But I'm interested for all of 10 seconds because it doesn't. Maybe it's a presentist bias, but I'm not impressed because I just think, well, you're just shoving metal through your arm. I'm really not that fussed by this in terms of and as so much fakirism sort of does focus on sort of potent bodily feats. Do you think there was a specific reason at the time that drew a crowd, that form of like almost bodily focus?
Yeah, well, one explanation, not necessarily for why it drew a crowd, but why it's interesting that it's Tahar Bay doing it, is I found it very significant that he was Armenian, and that this is a kind of, if you wanted to be have a psychoanalytical reading of it or something, this is a man who has just come as a sort of ethnicity through this massive trauma, which involved the death of hundreds of thousands of people, and now he is getting up on stage and conquering both pain and death in a way, and so I found that very interesting, and that's part of the reason why I found him a really fascinating character, because he does, especially later in his life, do some quite unpleasant things, but there's something about him as a refugee figure, him as like really one of the great underdogs of the 1920s, who kind of brings it back to become the celebrity, but then it all collapses at the end, really, because he's too selfish in a sense.
How does it collapse for him?
Well, during the Second World War, he is arrested because he tries to swindle a woman out of quite a lot of money, claiming that he can save her Jewish lover who has been taken away to an internment camp in Paris, which, as we now know, would have meant quite likely death.
Yeah.
It turns out actually there's some happy ending, and he does manage to get out some other way. But Tahar Bay pockets a lot of money, claiming that he can get this man out, and doesn't. A kind of, again, like a victim of a genocide in a sense, them exploiting another genocide.
Yeah, that's pretty cruel.
Yeah. And then he later ends up in Beirut, sort of just. I mean, yeah, he never reached the heights. Although he did spend quite a lot of his life in reasonably high luxury, making quite a lot of money out of his trade. So there is that.
Yeah. And then like the brief interlude here is this sort of this culture of imitation with Hamid Bey, sort of probably not necessarily the third figure of your book, but takes up a bit more time than other people who you directly connect to New Thought. I think there's sort of some manifestation and affirmation type stuff with Hamid Bey.
Because, and I think you're right when you say bodily kind of gross out performance can only go so far in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I
Yeah,
think the message.
the reason I say that is just because of the stage show emphasis. Sort of once you've seen that stage show, I mean, are you really going to go again unless there's some other reason? That's why it's like, how did this kind of very specific thing that you go, oh yeah, I've seen that act, but I'm not going to go see it again. Stay around. That's why it's kind of intriguing.
Yeah, and I think the answer is when people are successful, it stays around because there is a something more than just the act itself. And I think so. Two of these sort of direct imitators of Tahar Bay, who I cover in the book. Well, the first is Rahman Bey, who sort of directly challenges him, and then goes to America to do his act and faces up with Houdini, who Houdini sort of shows. This is one, but there's a big demonstration which Houdini shows that he could bury himself alive for an hour and a half in a coffin, and that kind of takes the wind out of his sails a little bit. And Rahman Bey really lasts a couple of years and then sort of disappears. Mm-hmm. Because in my interpretation, which I sort of feel that perhaps now you share, if it's just that, there's only so long you can go on doing that.
Just out of interest, the bay is that, what's the etymology of meaning?
Yeah. So bay, it's literally just an Ottoman title. So it's something like Sir, basically.
Okay.
But
they've all
they all adopt it as a thing, and they all dress the same too in this sort of Arab robes. Mm-hmm. And then Hamid Bey, who came to America with Rahman Bey, probably does the act, but then in the early 1930s, he turns it much more into a spiritual movement. He starts off actually, chronologically speaking, and also sort of logically speaking, it seems most likely that he got his inspiration from Swami Yogananda, who Steve Jobs' great idol, because he was in Yogananda's ashram or whatever it is in the early 1930s for a little bit and performed with him and more his sort of disciples, but then after then really shifts to say, oh, I'm not a stage performer, I am the leader of a sort of Coptic church, and he publishes some memoirs in which he talks about growing up in this clearly fictional sort of temple in Egypt, but then starts this sort of American Coptic society in which he preaches more than just I can stick a needle in my arm. It's kind of, he has sermons that he distributes to people about, and what he does pick up is American New Thought in some way, right? Which connects very well to his act. So American New Thought roughly being, if you can think positively about something, you can manifest it.
Yeah, Norman Vincent Peale, right?
Yeah, and all this, and he, and actually, Harriet Llewellyn McCullum is someone who co-authors or perhaps authors his memoirs. She is a psychologist, but is very much into the kind of you can think yourself into all kinds of, if you think about it hard enough, you can live for 200 years or whatever it might be. And that works well with his act too, because the whole sort of basis of his act, at least by one interpretation, is that if you can think hard enough, you can control your body. You can overcome death in a sense, right? He puts himself into a death-like state, then comes out. But he doesn't just do that. What he does is say, well, this has much broader meaning. The stuff that Tahar Bay had sort of started to say in his memoirs, Hamid Bey really kind of finishes off.
Does that transform into anything like an ashram or even a cult?
I mean, the movement still exists.
Oh,
Uh,
is it? I mean, were we talking thousands or?
no, I don't think we're
Okay.
talking, but they. I mean, I haven't looked that deeply into it, but they have a YouTube channel in which they occasionally have talks, at which it looks like, I don't know, 20 or 30 people turn up. But
And
uh,
what is that? Hamidism or?
no, it's the Coptic um, Society of America or something.
Okay.
I can't remember.
I mean, that's somewhat impressive to. I mean, that's roughly what 100 years.
Yeah, the Coptic Center. There you go. Yeah, it still goes. Yeah, it is impressive.
And then yeah, so after Hamid Bey, we moved through to Dr. Dahesh.
Yeah, and so if that part of the book, the Tahar Bay, Rahman Bay, Hamid Bay, is kind of uh, what the West saw of the East, basically. At least that's one way to categorize it. So all these people, uh, Rahman Bey and Hamid Bey were both Italian. Tahar Bay was Armenian, had come from the East, as it were, but they sell this kind of extremely exoticized view of the East.
I was just going to mention this actually. I mean, without sounding crass, was there any comment from any of them on the sort of the fact of pimping out and seemingly sort of pimping out and tweaking their culture to become really like a sideshow, like a stage show? Like fakirism has this mystical thing, and it's like, well, all right, let's get a bit of money out of it, right? Like they almost like they had to survive in the new world, quite literally.
Yeah, and they had to give people kind of what they wanted. Although, I mean, Rahman Ben Hamid, they are just Italian. I mean, it's not their culture, nor arguably is it really Tahar Bay's culture. But it's interesting that as an Easterner, Tahar Bay, like sort of bona fide, the best way to sell yourself is not necessarily as an Armenian refugee who a lot of people didn't like, but as this sort of mysterious sheikh who lots of people did quite or were like interested in the sort of Rudolph Valentino school, not in any way realistic, but a kind of image.
And this was the same for Dr. Dahesh?
Well, what he kind of ends up doing, at least one way of structuring it, is he does the mirror of this. He appears a little bit later. So he is the counterpart to Tahar Bay in the book. And in the sense they both have pretty similar histories in that. So Dr. Dahesh is Syriani, as a Syrian. And his family, although likewise not himself, were no doubt caught up in the same kind of genocide that Tahar Bay was. They're both refugees, though he's a Syrian refugee in Lebanon and Palestine, both born around the same time. Dahesh born a little bit later, and then have pretty difficult childhoods, which are heavily mythologized, and there's lots of stories about what happens in his childhood. A little bit hard to separate truth from fiction. There's various, walking on water probably didn't happen. But the fact that he basically bounced around a lot between Lebanon and Palestine and was probably pretty poor, that did happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then he appears in 1929. So that's the first time we really sort of have a external historical piece of information about him, in Jerusalem, performing a fakir act in some way, doing basically exactly the same things that Tahar Bay was doing. He was sticking pins into himself, burying himself alive. All of this he was doing, yeah. So that's the kind of reason I say that Tahar Bay is the one who starts all of this. But pretty quickly, Dr. Dahesh moves somewhere else entirely. And it's unclear to me, although I think probably he didn't at the beginning dress up in sort of the same sheikh's costume that Tahar Bay did. Though there are some pictures of him like dressed up in something like that, but very, very few. What he was dressed in was this much more kind of quintessentially Western suit, basically like a bow tie and a pocket square and all of this kind of thing. And instead of playing up the fakirism, he pretty swiftly starts to become almost exclusively a hypnotist. He was in fact not the first hypnotist of that kind to appear in the Middle East. There had been others before him who I talk about a bit. So Tahar Bay is one influence, but then this guy called Dr. Salomon is also another influence, and it's a whole thing. But then, so pretty good. By about 1930, he is predominantly a hypnotist. So him and his sister, who takes the name Antoinette, a stage name, very like westernizing again, both of them. And the basis of that act, which it is at that time, it is an act, as in like, later on he develops into something that's not, a stage act the same way. But she will go on stage, she will go into a hypnotic trance, he will blindfold her, and then she will receive questions from the audience about, I've lost my ring. I think someone's stolen it. Can you tell me where it is or who stole it? Or, I'm going traveling. What, should I be worried? I'd like to get married. Will I get married soon? And she will give the answer to these questions. He's not the first person to do a kind of act like this.
So is he saying that she's talking to some other side, some divine presence?
So pretty quickly, I'm not sure what he's saying, like in 1929, but by 1931, he is saying, and lots of other hypnotists too. So probably before then, but let's say by then, is saying this is a manifestation of spiritualism, the thing that we started talking about that happened in 1848. The idea that you can communicate with the spirits of the dead when they are around you. And basically the argument that he and other people make is that when someone like Antoinette goes into a trance, they are then in contact. Their physical body is unconscious in some way, but they are in contact with the world of the spirits, i.e. dead people who live alongside us in a kind of a parallel world. And that is where they're getting the answers from.
So this really isn't, when we say hypnotism, this really isn't the hypnotism of today, even though we're using the same word. I mean, there'd be a different public appreciation of it, at least.
Yeah, number one, it's not the hypnotism of today in which we think of, people hypnotize themselves to give up smoking, kind of medical, which has, I think, I'm sure on the NHS, that in some ways they suggest hypnotism. It's definitely not that, nor is it kind of the you're a chicken clock stage hypnotism. It really is spiritualism. And you can't, in the Arab world in the 20s and 30s, you can't talk about spiritualism without talking about hypnotism and vice versa.
Okay. And is this a key part of what comes to be known as Daheshism?
Yes. So this happens in the early 1930s. He spends the majority of the 1930s in Palestine, around Jerusalem. Not by about 34, 35, he's not really doing stage performances anymore. He has started to build up some kind of spiritual movement, the contours of which are pretty unclear, because we only have a few kind of accounts of it. But clearly it involves in some way communicating with the spirits, and it involves getting a lot of people into one house and sort of having spiritual brothers and kind of communing. He is in the late 1930s accused of swindling one of these people who's part of this group out of quite a lot of money. by the person themselves. The whole kind of the whole thing falls apart because one other prominent member, sides with the person who's accusing him, and he ends up in Beirut, still maintaining his innocence, but not going back to Palestine, never going back to Palestine. And it's in Beirut that he kind of starts this thing called Daeshism.
Right. And where does that move to? I mean, what does that kind of look like in its form in Beirut?
It's based largely around him, it seems. A lot of the accounts of it, there's one particular person who was a poet, actually quite an important Arabic poet of the early 20th century, who joins the movement. Quite a number of reasonably important people join this movement in Beirut, including the president's sister-in-law, and also member of this bit of extremely big Lebanese banking family, and some other kind of middle-class doctors and
always that way.
Yeah. It's always the dermatologists.
And so, yeah, I mean, so is this viewed as a religion? Are they listening to him give talks? What is the purpose of Daheshism?
Yeah, so a lot of the accounts, particularly by this one poet, focus on his miraculous deeds. So he would, which sometimes are summoning the spirits of the dead in a kind of very spiritualist way. Quite often they are things like, "Oh, I can see you're thinking of something," and then he will make a book appear, and it will be the thing that this person is thinking of, which was a book which they lost in Paris 10 years ago, and suddenly it's there again, and things like this. Basically, and quite often there'll be stories of people who have come because they're suspicious of him, and then he will do something along these lines, make something appear, is usually what it is, that they were looking for or thought was lost or could never be made to appear, and then they will be amazed by it.
See, what intrigues me about these, and I guess also with Tahar Bay and Dahesh, is that, I mean, it's intriguing that I think of another figure at this time, also intriguingly, with connections to Armenia, George Gurdjieff, who, he's creating a system which is for people's self-betterment, with a, very complicated, often at times very complicated systems, with less of pretty much none of these kind of, here's me doing a little trick type things. And so it seems that these forms are more of, dare I say it, probably because I'm more sympathetic to Gurdjieff, but more of like, it seems more of a spectacle. Like, you're not really meant to do so much. You're there to basically follow this person who can do strange feats.
Well, the thing, I mean, that's definitely a large part of it, at least in the accounts of this guy in particular, and also other people. They often mention the feats. But there is one thing. So he does also have some kind of metaphysical belief system.
Right.
Which has always seemed pretty vague to me. It's to do with sort of spiritual fluids inhabiting things, and I don't know what. But he also has a kind of political message which speaks to really a lot of people in 1940s Beirut, which is Dahishism is not a religion, or it is a spiritual creed that anyone from any religion can join, and what my main kind of goal is to end religious strife. So Muslims, Christians, Jews all come together under the banner of Dahishism. There's enough room for everyone. Come on in, and then the sort of, I don't think he would use the word the cancer, but whatever, the cancer of religious extremism will kind of disappear. Obviously, like, that's not a new message. In a sense, that's also the message of spiritualism. I mean, that's what spiritualists are very keen on the back saying. You can be a Christian spiritualist or a Buddhist spiritualist or a Muslim spiritualist. It's all the same. So he's doing a similar thing, but he's doing it in 1940s Beirut.
Yeah.
which is a ton. I mean, it's a country. Number one, it's basically just become independent,
Mm.
and it's an extremely religiously diverse city and country, probably perhaps more than anywhere in the world. And everyone is trying to figure out how to deal with this.
Yeah.
And the sort of political higher ups, the people who are the brother of this woman, Marie Haddad, who joins the Daeshism, is coming up with all these sort of complex, oh, well, let's have the kind of representation in parliament where the president is always a Maronite and the prime minister is always a Sunni Muslim and the speaker is always a Shia or whatever it is. I forget exactly what he comes up with, but he comes up with a complex system. Whereas Daesh is just saying, forget it, screw your complex, insane systems and just forget everything.
Let's just all get along.
Yeah, let's just all get along.
How does that go down in Beirut?
It's a little bit hard to say because he does not go down that well in Beirut.
Okay.
Whether that's because of his message or not is a little bit hard to say, or whether a lot of people just think he's running a strange cult. I mean, you can sort of make your own mind up on that to an extent, right? Either interpretation is possible, but and the fact that the president's sister-in-law is a member of this group is puts him in contest with some pretty powerful people. And it doesn't take long for him to be expelled from the country.
Okay.
And
then, where does he?
Perhaps, I mean, perhaps on the, I didn't really have to tie it down, but it could be on this law that they had recently been brought in against, like, basically the practice of spiritualism.
Okay.
Well,
this might be a juncture just to bring in, because I want to bring in, because I don't often get a chance to mention it. I mean, does this have connections? Because he has a strange connection to the folklore of Islamic jinn, basically Islamic demons, right? I mean, is this somewhat tied in there as well, or?
It's my interpretation is no. My what my view about his relationship to jinn and jinn summoning is that, so again, for people who might not know, there is a long-standing practice in the Islamic world of jinn summoning, which goes back several centuries before the 20th century, at least, in which people invoke the power of the jinn in some ways, sometimes in different ways, lighting incense and all this kind of stuff, and then call upon the jinn, perhaps to give answers to certain questions, like, I'm going on a journey, what will I do? I've lost my ring. What am I going to do with it? And then the jinn in some way will answer. People did this in lots of different ways, but at least, for several centuries and up to the 20th century, people were still doing it in one particular way, in which they, the jinn summoner blindfolds usually a small child, and then there's a shiny surface is involved, which doesn't happen in hypnotism, but that's also part of jinn summoning. And then people will come and ask sort of this blindfold child exactly the same kind of questions that we've just been talking about. I lost my ring. Who stole it? I'm going on a journey. Or often it's stolen goods or this kind of thing. So, and that is going on. That is a practice that continues well into the 1930s, time that we're talking about. And we know this because there's lots of court cases of people being kind of sued for swindling people out of money through this process. And my basic argument about hypnotists is that they're basically doing pretty much exactly the same thing as jinn summoners,
right.
But they have, and this is where it comes back to the West and the East, their explanation for it is always this is the hypnotist. This is Western science. They very frequently say they have some kind of degree from blank university in the West. So, Dr. Dahesh Bey, uh, sort of people say that he was given a doctorate by the Sage Institute in Paris for some. For the story later becomes, doesn't really tell at the beginning, but later that he was buried himself in the Seine for 2 days and was given an honorary doctorate at the end of it. The Sage Institute is actually like a mail order hypnosis kind of sort of mail order degree place that was run out of Paris by this guy, this slightly unusual guy called Xenophon Lamotte Sage.
Wow.
Who was a swindler.
Another swindler.
Another swindler of a high order. But Dr. Salomon, too, claims to have degrees from Brussels. So one thing that these guys are doing is the opposite to Tahar Bay and Hamid Bey and all these guys. They're selling this kind of the secret mysteries of Western science, basically.
Yeah. Okay. And so why is it that Dahesh gets kicked out of Beirut? Just to jump back.
The short answer is he makes too many enemies.
Okay.
And there's press campaigns against him, and perhaps he violates this law about spiritualism, or perhaps he is extrajudicially exiled. Stories differ. Why he made enemies, like I say, you can decide for yourself whether it's because of his message or because he was running a slightly suspicious organization that people, at least from the outside, looked at and said, we don't like the look of this for whatever reason.
And you know, I like the Coptic church there. Is Daheshism still around? Is there any?
So it is. It is. So what happens is that he gets expelled. It is announced at the end of the 1940s that he's been executed in Iranian Azerbaijan. It appears in the papers. Then several years later, he returns from the dead.
Does he say that? Does he say that he came back from the dead? Or?
He said he came up from the dead. The explanation is that he has several different kind of personalities of himself that walk the earth at the same time.
Of course.
And it was one of those who got killed.
Right.
And then he comes back to Beirut and lives out the rest of his life basically there. He ends up dying in Connecticut, in the US, but not necessarily living there. I think he traveled a lot then in his later years. He did various, also there's, in the 60s in Beirut, which is a fascinating time in itself, like a very kind of easy living, free time, a sort of golden age of Lebanese society, Arab society in general. I mean, that's when a lot of literature and poetry and films all come out of there. And he's there too, performing these sort of strange feats. The stories about his strange feats become even more exaggerated, a kind of to the level of like total disbelief. In the sense that there's a story at one party. There's a picture of Beethoven on the wall on a painting, and a picture of Rembrandt, and he sort of gets them down from those paintings, and Beethoven starts to play the piano, and Rembrandt does a nice picture.
Right.
Yeah.
Not sure what to really. I mean, who's writing that? Yeah.
I mean, it's one story that is sent to a newspaper in America, which, I mean, who knows really whether it's someone making fun of him or whether it's someone who believes all this. But there are lots of stories like this. The other big story that circulates, which is an interesting tie in it, is that he goes to a barber shop. And he sees there's a very long queue. The barber says, it's going to be an hour. So he takes his head off, leaves it on the table and says, I'll be back in an hour and a half. Let me know when you're done, kind of thing. Okay. And his body goes for a little walk around the neighborhood. Interestingly, so Tahar Bay, after being in Europe, after being in America with Aldous Huxley, also settles down in Beirut in the 1960s. and people tell exactly the same story about Tahar Bay, the barber, that barbershop story, taking the head up. So it's clearly a story that's kind of going around.
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, are people still following Dahesh?
And then I mean more so than following Hamid Bey.
Okay.
Although again the numbers are pretty hard to make out.
Yeah.
I would say.
What does that look? Again, is it a YouTube channel or is there a church or a meeting or?
Well, actually, the biggest, funnily enough, like the real physical embodiment is an art museum.
Okay.
In New York.
Dahesh's art, or
of his, as well as many other things, he was an art collector.
Okay.
Of if you're being mean about it, of bad 19th century art. Though the technical term is academic art.
Okay. Have you been?
It is currently closed to the public.
Okay.
It's in New York.
Right.
The collection occasionally tours. Okay. They have since he died in 1984. They have acquired quite a lot of good pieces of art, good pieces of 19th century art, and so they lend them out sometimes. But that's the sort of, strangely enough, the biggest kind of physical manifestation of Dr. Dahesh is an art museum in New York.
Odd. It's odd these little figures end up with these strange sort of hangovers that are still around. Did you happen to, as he died in 1984, did you happen to speak with anyone who knew Dahesh?
No, I didn't. I talked to quite a lot of people who say, "Oh, my grandmother, who's now dead, was part of the Daesh group or something." It's so going to Lebanon. He's a curious figure in terms of actually, right? How much do how important were these people? Are these just like are they forgotten greats, or are they forgotten people that no one ever knew about in the first place? In the case of Tahar Bay, I mean, I think, like I said, he was a big celebrity, but for about a year.
Yeah.
And then other people came in his path who were big celebrities for perhaps 6 months. But Dahesh, I would say you talk to pretty much anyone in Lebanon over the age of 60 or so, and they will have heard of him. They will kind of know a bit, particularly if they were, in Beirut in that time, even in the 50s and 60s. But you talk to anyone in Lebanon, majority of people under 40, and they'll have no idea.
So this, for the book is really just to give this snapshot of this happened, like this strangeness happened, and these,
this happened, and also, sort of to bring this back to what we were talking about at the beginning, to say that the cultural history of the Middle East and the Arab world is much sort of stranger and richer and more diverse than people really think about. And, to sort of answer that person whose name I've now forgotten, who said there was no occult in the Middle East, it didn't happen, because, and partly if there's I don't think I have a mission really, but, if there's a thing that maybe this book does, is to say that the history of the Middle East is much more complex and rich than people make it out to be.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add about your book that you feel is key that we haven't touched on?
No, I don't know. I mean, I think we did. We did most of it. There are lots of bits that you should buy the book and read.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot more of the history there. So, what are you working on now?
I'm starting work on a book about, so very nascently, about a 19th century Egyptian Jewish anti-colonial activist who was the first man to publish a satirical journal in the Middle East.
Oh wow!
And also a fascinating guy.
Just getting nicher and nicher.
Yeah. But but also central to colonial history.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully in time I'll get to talk to you about that book whenever
that.
But yeah, it seems like a good place to finish up. So I'll be sure to put the links for Holy Man of the Electromagnetic Age in the description below, and for the Hearst website and for your own website. But Raphael, Cormack, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me on.